Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my February wrap up and telling you about all the things that I read in the month of February. So, in February I read 14 books. 6 of them were unpublished books that I read for work. I work for a publisher, so I have to read a lot for work as well. But 8 of them are published books that I can talk to you about today. So I will start off, as always, with the classics. This month I read the Victorian novel Hester by Margaret Oliphant, which I absolutely loved. This was an incredible read and I'm so glad I finally read it. I have read quite a few Margaret Oliphants. This is my 6th Margaret Oliphant book, I think. And the first thing I read by Margaret Oliphant was Persephone Books' bind-up of 2 of her novellas, The Mystery of Mrs. Blencarrow and Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond. And Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond was so amazing. And everything I've read by Margaret Oliphant since has not lived up to that. Until this, which was amazing and incredible, and I would highly recommend. Definitely a great place to start with Margaret Oliphant as well. This novel really blew me away. In fact, it's been ages since I read a Victorian novel that wasn't a reread that blew me away in this way. I think this is probably the Victorian novel that has blown me away the most since I read Olive by Dana Mullet-Craik. So it's been like a year and a half since I read a Victorian book this good. I don't think I love Hester as much as Olive, but it is an incredible book and I would highly, highly recommend it. In this novel, we follow a young woman called Hester Vernon, and at the beginning of this book, she and her mother move to England to a small town. They have been living abroad in France for many years. And Hester and her mother come to this town where their family, the Vernons, are incredibly important. There is a big bank in this town which is very, very successful, which is very, very respected, which is run by the Vernon family and always has been. And you find out at the very beginning of the book that it had previously been run by Hester's father, who is dead by the beginning of the book, but that he didn't look after the money well enough and that he brought the bank to the brink of ruin and then ran away, leaving his cousin Catherine Vernon to step in and basically save the bank. That is the kind of background to this book, but Hester does not know this, and when she arrives in this town where her and her mother have been given sort of cheaper rent by their relation Catherine Vernon, Hester is amazed to find that Catherine Vernon sort of hates their family and she doesn't know why. And in this book we follow Hester, we follow her relationship with Catherine Vernon and also her relationship with 3 young men who are potentially interested in her. This was an amazing novel for many reasons. It reminded me quite a lot of Elizabeth Gaskell, with maybe a little bit of Hardy thrown in as well. It was beautifully written and the characterisation was wonderful, and the thing I loved more than anything, I think, is the way this book explored the position of women within 19th century society. Both Hester and Catherine are these incredibly intelligent women who are sort of constricted by Victorian society to play particular roles, and Catherine, because of her cousin's failure, sort of ended up in business and was able to be a woman in business, but Hester sort of desperately wants to work and isn't allowed. And the way this book looks at that and the kind of frustration of being a woman in the 19th century and what women were and weren't allowed to do, and how that creates tension between Hester and Catherine when they are very alike in many ways, is fascinating, and I loved it. It was so incredibly kind of empowering and fascinating. I loved the ending. It was so dramatic. It was one of those books where it had like a fairly slow build for like the first 75%. In the last quarter of the book it was just so exciting. So I absolutely loved it. I'd highly, highly recommend it. This is going to be the next book I do a #feminist Victorians video on. I'm going to make a video talking about this as sort of proto-feminism and the way it explores gender later in the month. Most of that video will be spoiler free, but there will be some spoilers at the end, so you have a few weeks before that comes out if you do want to pick this up. This is absolutely amazing. Highly, highly recommend it. Definitely one of my favourite books of the year so far, and yeah, like I said, it's been a long time since I read a Victorian book that wasn't a reread that impressed me this much. It was absolutely incredible. Just, yeah, so amazing, so powerful, so dramatic, such incredible characterisation. I loved the ending. I loved the way it looked at the position of women in 19th century society, and yeah, just absolutely fantastic. Would highly, highly recommend. Next, I read A Passage to India by Ian Forster. This is my penultimate Ian Forster. I only now have one of his books left to read, which is really strange. So after I've read The Longest Journey, which is my last Ian Forster, I think I might make an author week on Ian Forster and talk about all of his books in a bit more detail. But in February, I read A Passage to India, which I buddy read with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish and Claudia from the Spinster's Library. This is set in India and it follows the lives of various different characters, some of whom are Indians and some of whom are sort of Anglo-Indians, British people living in India in the 1920s. And we follow a few different people in particular, including an Indian doctor called Aziz, Mr. Fielding, a British man who is his friend and is sort of very detached from the kind of governmental British presence in India. And then we also follow two women, Mrs. Moore, who is an elderly woman who comes over to India and is sort of fascinated by it and wants to understand India properly and not just sort of live an Anglo-Indian life. And then we also follow Miss Quested, who has sort of been brought over to see what India is like because she is thinking about marrying Mrs. Moore's son, who lives and works in India. And we follow these characters and what happens to them. And I'm not going to say more than that because one of my favourite things about Ian Forster is that I find his plots really, really unpredictable. Like, I never know, reading an Ian Forster novel, what is going to happen. I never have a clue what's going to happen next. And sometimes I'll be like, I feel like something bad is going to happen, but I won't know what it will be. And it's always incredibly unexpected. And I feel as well like sometimes in an Ian Forster novel, the relationship, like the character relationship that you think is going to be at the heart of the novel, or the character who you think is going to be at the heart of the novel, turns out to not be the one who is at the heart of the novel by the end, which I really enjoy and I think is very clever. This is really, really fascinating. It really interestingly explores sort of culture clash in the 1920s in India, and the kind of complexities of the relationship between British and Indian people within India then. It's a really fantastic character study as well. The characters in here are so sort of complex and interestingly developed, and it is beautifully written. I just think Ian Forster's dialogue is incredible. I listened to this on audiobook, the audiobook narrated by Sam Daster, which was really, really good, and I would highly recommend that as well. Yeah, just a really fantastic novel. Then I also read quite a lot of historical fiction this month. I buddy read The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Anne-Marie Crowhurst with Jenny from Bookish Shenanigans. So in this novel we follow a woman called Ursula Flight from her birth up until her sort of early 20s, so it's a bit of a coming of age story set in the late 17th century, and we follow Ursula from her sort of very upper class upbringing into a quite difficult life. And the book looks really interestingly at the position of women within late 17th century society and the sort of restrictions upon them, as well as looking interestingly at class. Another very interesting thing about this book is that Ursula Flight, from the very beginning of her life, wants to be a playwright or an actress. She's incredibly interested in the theatre, and a lot of passages within this book are in the form of plays, which is quite fun. And there's other interesting use of forms such as diaries and things like that too. I really enjoyed this book, and I would definitely read anything else that Anne-Marie Crowhurst publishes in the future, because it was a really interesting novel and it was really well written and the characterization was great. However, I didn't think it was perfect, and I kept on reading it and thinking, why aren't I enjoying this as much as I feel like I should be, considering what it's about and considering the premise of the characters? And I think there were two things, one of which is to do with the book and one of which is to do with me. And the one that is to do with me is that actually I realised that a lot of my favourite historical fiction has some like mystery element in it, and this doesn't have any mystery element in it. Like, you don't know what's going to happen next, but there isn't any mystery to be solved or to think about, or there isn't some reveal of some mystery. And I slightly missed that here, but obviously like that's just my personal preference. It's nothing to do with the book. However, I would say that I think the pacing is slightly off in this book. The last quarter of this book was fantastic. Like, that was real 5-star quality amazingness for me. I loved it so much, and I feel like that 3/4 point should have come halfway through the book. Like, I think this is an amazing novel in many ways and I loved it a lot, but I felt like the first half dragged a lot, and then the last quarter was over too soon, when that was like the highlight of the book for me. And I feel like the pacing could have been shifted around a lot and it would have created a more powerful read for me. So yeah, I did really enjoy it, and like I said, I definitely read more by her in the future, but it wasn't completely perfect for me. I also read Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, which the publisher very kindly sent me a copy of. So this is a really interesting novel. It is a fictionalised account of the life of Cassandra Austen, who was Jane Austen's sister, and it follows Cassandra Austen in sort of a few different timelines, one of which is in the 1840s, when Jane Austen has been dead for years. Cassandra is an old woman, and she's sort of come to stay with people who are relations of the man she was engaged to when she was very young, who died. So they're sort of not exactly her family, but they feel a bit like her family. And she comes to stay with this younger friend of hers after this friend's father has died, and she finds in this house letters from her and from her sister Jane to members of this family, which she is determined to sort of get out of the house before everything else is cleared in the wake of this death. And then from this present moment, Cassandra also looks back on her life from her early 20s to the time that Jane, her sister, died. So I went into this book feeling a little bit sceptical, partly because I don't know how I feel about books written about people who are real, and sometimes I find fictionalised accounts of real people a bit weird, or I find it's tricky to feel that an author is truly respectful of that person. That was one reason why I was a bit wary of this. And the other reason is because I know a lot about the Austen family. Jane Austen is probably the real historical figure, not just literary, but historical in general, that I know the most about. I know a lot about her life. I know a lot about her family. I have read many biographies of Jane Austen. I used to work at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath. I know a lot about Jane Austen's life, and I know a lot about her family, to the extent that, like, I was worried when going into this that the portrayal of Jane Austen and her family wouldn't match up with the idea in my head. And also I was worrying that if they played with history a bit, as films like Becoming Jane do, I would know what was wrong. However, there was one tiny thing that I had a slight issue with, which was that I didn't agree with the portrayal of Mrs. Austen. I felt she was characterised, especially in the first half, as being a bit like Mrs. Bennet, which I see done quite a lot in like reimaginings of Jane Austen's life, and it really annoys me because everything we know about Jane and Cassandra's mother was that she was a really practical, creative woman who like wrote comic verse, and who Jane Austen like had got a lot of her creativity and wanting to write from. And that wasn't really explored in here, and I didn't feel that she was done right. But everything else and everyone else I thought was wonderful, and I loved it. Obviously this is a book about the Austens in many ways, and I think the fact that I know a lot about the Austens, that I knew all of the people in this book from history, as it were, meant that I loved this even more, because I recognised people and I knew things that it was doing. And there's one thing in particular where they take a sort of myth or story about Jane Austen and then make it so that it was actually sort of connected to Cassandra instead, which I thought was beautifully done and so wonderful, and really fantastically plays with like all of the different myths we've created around Jane Austen and all of the stories we feel we have to write about her and think about her. And I really, really loved that. I thought that was so cleverly done. And if you didn't know much about Jane Austen's life, you wouldn't know that that was a myth connected with Jane Austen. So I feel like the fact I know a lot about Jane Austen actually really added to my love of this. But also, aside from all of that, and aside from the fact it's a wonderful exploration of like the Austen family and really looks fantastically at this family who were fascinating, also it's just a beautiful novel about grief. Partly about Cassandra's grief for her sister, partly about her grief for her fiancé who died, and partly about the grief of like the life she could have had with him that she hasn't had, and partly about grief of a lot of other different characters. The book begins with her coming to see her friend Isabella, whose father has just died. She's in this house of mourning, and this book is really a book about grief and memory and looking back on your past and being content with the life you had, even if you grieve the life that you could have had. I loved it so much. It is incredibly beautiful, really, really moving, really, really powerful. It really, really touched me. I feel like it is incredibly respectful because it paints this portrait of this amazing family, and it does focus on Cassandra, which I liked as well, not as much on Jane. Like, don't get me wrong, there are bits in it which are about Jane Austen a lot, but actually it focuses on Cassandra, who was Jane Austen's best friend and like life companion, who was incredibly important to her, and who we often don't think about because we just think about the author, not all of these women around her who were also kind of amazing too. So that was really cool and I really loved it. So it was really cool and I really loved it. And like I said, the thing where they take a myth/story about Jane Austen and make it actually a bit about Cassandra was awesome. That was really, really cool, and I really, really liked that. I thought that was a wonderful idea, and it really highlights like all of the kind of mythology we've created around Jane Austen, and the kind of unreliability of history and what's recorded and how little we actually know about this family. Even though, like I said, I feel like I know them from history and from biographies, but of course I don't. So yeah, it was incredible and I would highly, highly recommend it. If you're looking for things to read later on in the year in Jane Austen July, this could be a good one. I then also read Birdcage Walk by Helen Dunmore. I've been reading quite a lot of Helen Dunmore lately and I'm finding her absolutely incredible. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Ellen Fenney and it was fantastic. So this is set in late 18th century Bristol, and it follows a young woman called Lizzie. Towards the beginning of the book, she is newly married to a man called Dinah. She has left behind her mother and stepfather, who are sort of radicals and writers. But now she marries this more conventional man called Dinah, who is a builder, who is building this new row of terraces in Bristol as an investment. And Dinah has been married before, and his wife Lucy died. And Lizzie, his new wife, kind of struggles living in the shadow of Lucy, especially because Dinah doesn't tell her that much about his past life with her. And meanwhile, while we are looking at Lizzie and Dinah's relationship, This is all set against the backdrop of the French Revolution, which is happening in France as the story carries on. But of course, it has kind of ripples in England, and Dinah is very much against it and is kind of appalled by the fact that people are tearing down the state, whereas Lizzie's mother and stepfather and all of their circle are thinking, you know, this is the beginning of a new world, which is going to be fantastic. Helen Dunmore writes brilliantly, and I think she paces books in a way that I really like, where there is quite a slow build until an incredibly dramatic finale, which I really, really loved. I also think her characterization is amazing. Dinah is a sort of work of genius in terms of his characterization. He's just incredibly well crafted, and Lizzie too is wonderful, and all of the people around her and her kind of changing relationships with the people around her. It's just done so well. It is a book about grief, it is a book about family and relationship, it is a book about understanding or not understanding the people around you, and it's also a book about the kind of battle between creation and destruction, and what it means to destroy something and what it means to create something in a really interesting way. It was incredible. I just think Helen Dunmore was the most amazing writer, and the more I read by her, the more I just think she's an absolute new favourite, and she's just amazing. I'm so impressed by what she writes, and I'm so impressed by the quality of her characterisation as well, and of the like drama and tension of her endings. I just cannot wait to read everything she's ever written, because she's just absolutely fantastic. Moving away from the historical fiction, another wonderful book I read this month was Evening Class by Maeve Binchy. I have to say, actually, this has been a really incredible reading month. Out of the 8 books I'm telling you about today, 5 of them were 5-star reads. Like, I read a lot of fantastic stuff in February. Anyway, back to Evening Class, which was one of the fantastic books. This is a novel from 1996 and it's set in Dublin. And what I really loved about this book is that while it is a novel, it is also one of those novels that I love that are in the form of interconnected short stories, sort of. So basically this book follows all of these different characters who are sort of joined together by being part of this evening class, which is run at a local school. It is run by a woman who calls herself Signora, who is Irish but spent sort of 25 years of her life in Italy. She comes back and she starts this evening class teaching people Italian. And this book is divided into sort of large sections which each follow a different character who attends the evening class. So we follow all of these characters who are connected by this class, and each section is like a vignette that mostly follows their life, but sort of also you get to see bits of the other character's life through that. And then the final part of the book is like everyone together. And so you get to follow all of these different characters' lives and how they interweave, but in little individual snapshots, which I love. It's a format that I just really, really enjoy in books, and it's something that I think was really, really done well here. And all of these characters have very interesting and very different lives, and a lot of the sections kind of tell, you know, decades of someone's life before they end up starting this evening class in a really, really clever way. Maeve Binchy's writing is wonderful, and especially is wonderful at telling a long story and a lot of someone's life in a very compact and still emotionally powerful way, which I thought was wonderful. Her writing actually reminded me quite a lot of Barbara Pym, so I think if you like Barbara Pym, you will probably enjoy Evening Class. There were a lot of things in this book that I really, really loved. The character relationships are incredible, and the characterization, especially considering how many characters there are in here, is just wonderful. It was a really, really engaging read as well. Like, this is quite a long book and I absolutely flew through it. I just thought it was wonderful. So yeah, I can't wait to read more by Maeve Binchy in the future. This was a fantastic read. Finally, after all of those 4- and 5-star reads, I have 2 books which I didn't enjoy very much, which were like 2-star reads for me. One is Ethereal Worlds by Tatiana Tolstana. This is a collection of short stories in translation, and they just weren't my thing at all. To be honest, I read this 2 or 3 weeks ago and I only remember 2 stories. Every other single story in this I just have completely forgotten, and I got absolutely nothing out of at all. Those 2 stories that I remember I thought were quite interesting, but even then I didn't sort of love them. I think this just wasn't my style and wasn't for me. Some of the stories are a bit sort of magic realist or a bit weird, and a lot of them felt very, very detached. I didn't really feel I could get invested in the characters at all. To be honest, I just think this was a case of this not fitting my reading taste. It wasn't really for me, it was a bit too literary for me. So yeah, I wouldn't really especially recommend recommend this, and it was definitely just not my style. And finally, I also listened on audiobook to The Horological by Mark Forsyth, which I also didn't love. So in January, me and my fiance Nick listened to The Etymological by Mark Forsyth, and we absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic non-fiction book about the history of words and where they came from and how they link to each other, and it was fantastic. So the next thing we listened to on audiobook together was The Horological, also by Mark Forsyth, because we were expecting that we'd really like that too. And it just isn't as good as The Etymologicon by quite a long way. The Horologicon is a non-fiction book about words that have fallen out of use and that no longer exist in the English language. But it sort of wasn't that interesting. And I think it's partly because the structure didn't really work. It's structured around like times of day that you might want to use these words, which I felt didn't really work as a structure. And whereas in the Etymologicon I felt like we got a lot more context behind the history of words, in this we're sort of just told about words that don't exist anymore, but we don't really get the context behind it, and we don't really have the same sort of humour and light writing style. I don't know, it just was a big disappointment after the Etymologicon, but it wasn't nearly as good. So there we go. So there we have it. Those are all the books that I read in February. In general, a really fantastic reading month. I read some wonderful, wonderful things. So yeah, that is it for now. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. And that's all. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.